Recently, one of my friends invited me to join him at a national forest in Missouri. If you know Mark Twain National Forest, that's the freaking place. He's a close friend and a forester who had some work to do there. But since his birthday was coming up, he invited me and another friend to camp out there for the night. It was a Friday and he spent most of the day working. He finished around 2 p.m., so we started looking for a spot to rest. We found a swimming area with lots of people, but it felt awkward, so we decided to find a camping site instead. We eventually found a solid spot, a clearing surrounded by big trees. We set up our tents there, one for each of us, and did all the usual camping stuff. Around 6 p.m., we were chatting about our forester friend's work. It was a far cry from what he was into back in high school. The conversation kept circling around his job and what else a forester does. A little later, we heard a rustling noise not too far away. We all stood up and turned on our powerful flashlights, but we didn't see anything. About 10 minutes later, we heard rustling again, this time from a different part of the campsite. We did the same thing, pointing our flashlights around, but still saw nothing. Around 20 minutes later, while we were eating, we heard rustling again. We could hear it getting closer to our spot. I stood up and pointed the flashlight around, and to my shock, I saw 2 coyotes approaching us. They must have smelled the meat we were eating and had probably been drawn to it while we were cooking. Later, when we were about to sleep, we made sure there were no animals lurking around. We decided to stay up late since we had no work the next day and set up 3 hammocks. It was a beautiful night with lots of stars in the sky. While I was lying in my hammock, thinking about various things, I heard a sound. My 2 friends woke up as well. The sound was strange. We shined our flashlights around but couldn't see anything in the trees. Then I realized the sound was coming from above. Something was rustling the leaves, and branches were snapping. I was terrified. It wasn't a bird, and if it was, it must have been huge because leaves were falling from the treetops. We also noticed that all the crickets and other animal noises had stopped. We tried to shine our flashlights up, but the branches and leaves were too thick to see through. Then, suddenly, we heard a swish sound like something cutting through the air. When we looked up through the clearing, we saw a bright light. It moved so fast that we were almost blinded and couldn't see its true shape. The light flew away quickly, and the rustling in the trees stopped. The animal noises resumed. It was so weird because no matter how much we thought about it, we couldn't figure out why it was glowing or why it was in the treetops. We also smelled something like gasoline and burning electrical wires, but we couldn't connect it to the light we saw. That was the creepiest experience I've had recently, and it made all the hair on my neck stand on end. Despite all that, we stayed until morning. Back in 2010, we used to visit a forest in the Manzano Mountain section of Cibola National Forest in New Mexico. My dad loved hunting. It was something my grandpa taught him, and being a retired military personnel, it was a way for him to cope with his experiences from his deployments in the 1990s. But that's another story. He always took me along, and even though I was only 15, he taught me how to handle and fire a gun. He said we should go camping at least once so I could experience it. According to him, as a future old man, I needed these experiences so I could pass them on to my own kids someday. He also wanted me to learn life skills that could save my life in times of danger. At the time, I didn't take his words seriously. I just enjoyed our trips and didn't really understand the concepts of vigilance or the reality of danger. I was carefree and didn't fully appreciate his teachings, though I was happy and felt safe with him. One morning, we walked through the forest, joking about how stupid deer could be. He told me that deer would freeze in the middle of the road, even with cars honking at them, but in the forest, they would bolt at the slightest sound. We laughed, and by midday we had caught 4 rabbits. In the afternoon, we found a spot far from the usual camping areas. There were no other campers around, and we were on a higher part of the forest, overlooking a distant camping spot. We set up our single tent and took a rest. As dusk approached, he sent me to gather twigs around our campsite for the fire, sparing the larger logs for later. I went to the back of our site where there were plenty of small branches. While gathering, we suddenly heard 5 consecutive gunshots. I stopped and looked around, trying to pinpoint the direction of the shots. My dad stood up, scanning the area. He called me back to the campsite, saying those weren't hunting rifles. He thought they were M16s. I didn't understand why he was so certain, but I shrugged it off, thinking guns were normal here and it might just be a hunting rifle. But my dad became increasingly uneasy, constantly scanning our surroundings. I asked why he was making such a big deal out of it. He explained there was no gun range nearby, and it was unusual for hikers and campers to carry such high-caliber firearms. He told me if we heard more shots, we'd leave immediately for safety. I agreed, trusting him to keep us safe. About 30 minutes later, as we cleaned the rabbits for dinner, we heard 3 more shots, followed by a scream. My dad confirmed the shots sounded like the earlier ones and were from the same distance. He decided to investigate but made me promise to stay at the campsite. He handed me our hunting rifle and took his pistol. He told me to listen for 3 claps when he returned and to be suspicious of anyone approaching without that signal. He walked towards the east, leaving me alone with the rabbits and the rifle. As it grew darker, I tried to continue cleaning the rabbits, but my nerves kept me on edge. Suddenly, I heard footsteps about 10 meters away. I crouched behind a tree, clutching the rifle. A man in a denim jacket emerged from the tree line, looking around nervously. He spotted our campsite and froze. In the fading light, I could barely see him, but I watched as he cautiously approached the campfire, removing his jacket. Assessing he was unarmed, I stood up and boldly asked what the problem was. Startled, he bolted, running down the slope and into the underbrush. My heart pounded as I watched him disappear, leaving only the sounds of dry leaves and breaking twigs in his wake. A few minutes later, I heard the signal. 3 claps. My dad returned, having seen flashlights moving away in the distance but no people. I told him about the man and showed him the abandoned jacket, which had blood on the side. Inside the jacket pockets, we found 2 empty pistol magazines and several packets of what looked like crystal meth. My dad surmised the man was fleeing from something, possibly a failed drug trade, given the drugs and the gunfire. We carefully made our way back to the car, constantly on guard, and drove to the police station to report the incident. My dad knew one of the officers, making the reporting process smoother. A few days later, at home, my dad told me it was likely a drug deal gone wrong. The police found various shell casings and blood stains at the site of the gunfire. I was relieved we were safe, and though I didn't fully understand the gravity of what happened at the time, I knew my dad's instincts had kept us from danger. Recently, I saw a video on YouTube posted by a vlogger about the journey of migrants from South America to the United States. It featured some of the trials these migrants face as they cross from one country to another, even though it's illegal in the eyes of the law. I got curious and felt a deep ache in my chest, especially when I showed it to my mom and dad, who had experienced something similar on their way to the US. They had told me bits and pieces of their story before, but I never knew the full story from start to finish. They only recently shared the whole thing with me because I asked out of interest. Honestly, I regret asking a little, not because I wasn't interested, but because of how much I pitied them. I realized that's probably why they never told me everything before. The experience was just too harrowing. My parents are from Venezuela, and this happened back in 1994. My mom was 19 and my dad was 21. Dad was an orphan, and mom's parents and two younger sisters were still alive. They were utterly fed up with their hardships, and neither had decent jobs. Dad worked for my uncle, earning very little from farming and often being mistreated. They hadn't married yet because Dad wasn't confident in his earnings. Rumors spread in their town about some families planning to cross the border and go to Mexico to escape the chaos and poverty in Venezuela. They didn't originally plan to come here. One night, Dad went to the place where the migrants gathered. He brought Mom and her family, while Dad didn't inform his brother, who stayed behind. They had just enough money to pay off some corrupt law enforcement and a few members of an illegal group for protection, as this was the start of the Darien Gap. Everyone was desperate to migrate, even leaving behind cars as bribes just to get out of Venezuela. They were already in Colombia at this point and waited about 3 days for the go-ahead. They started their walk in the jungle, making it hard for authorities in the countries they passed through to spot them. They had to pay bribes to the illegal groups controlling the territories they crossed. Initially, the walk was okay. They had food and medicine. There were many of them, and the numbers grew as they reached more borders since locals joined them too. On the third day, their ordeal began. They were still in Colombia, and it rained heavily. They had to stop, though many continued walking. They took shelter under a large tree for about an hour and a half. When the rain subsided a bit, they started walking again, grateful for the company of others. Ahead, about a few miles, they saw people huddled and talking in low voices. They were warned not to proceed because armed men were spotted ahead. They stopped again, and the rain poured down. After 2 hours of walking, they were horrified and in tears when they stumbled upon dead bodies. Dad estimated it was 4 to 5 families, all lifeless. People said these families encountered armed men who tried to extort money from them, even though the group they had spoken to didn't have the right to demand money. Unable to pay, they were killed. Luckily, Dad's group wasn't found, or they might have faced the same fate since some had little money left. That night was even scarier as gunshots echoed, and they shut their eyes in fear and cold. The rain made the children sick. My 2 aunts, who were young then, developed severe coughs and fevers, often convulsing at night. Dad and Grandpa had to carry them, slowing them down. Once, they had to stay behind because one of my aunt was convulsing so badly they thought they'd have to leave her body behind, which was heartbreaking. But thankfully, medicine and prayers to God kept her alive. They got lost and couldn't find their way. They saw discarded clothes with blood and a horrible stench. There was a cliff with an even worse smell below. They didn't look down and tried to find their way instead before dark. When they found it, they were relieved to join a family from their village in Venezuela, who had 6 children, mostly under 12. There were other Venezuelan families too. The next day, it poured again, and they had to cross a river. The current was strong because of the rain, but they couldn't stop due to fear of the rebels, who were rumored to frequent the area. There was a rope, but because of the children, they had to be carried. Dad crossed first with my 2 aunts. They all crossed, including Mom and her family. Next, the family they knew crossed. The father got 5 kids and his wife across, but as he crossed with his last child, the water surged with debris. The current was so strong it pulled the father and child away, and they vanished into the muddy water. The mother, now in shock, neglected her kids, so Dad and Mom cared for them as they walked. The next day, they were near Panama. Migrants they met said there was aid in Yaviza, giving them hope since they were low on food and water. They didn't know my 2 aunts were near pneumonia. Grandpa was coughing and weak. As they walked to Yaviza, Grandpa coughed up blood. They didn't know what to do. Their feet were sore, and the path was rocky, worsening their wounds. They were weak from hunger and illness. When they reached Yaviza, They cried in frustration because there was no aid, only vendors who looked at them with disdain, especially those who couldn't buy anything. Luckily, there were aid stations ahead, but they had to walk further. Grandpa was weakening, but they made it. Another problem was one of the children of the grieving mother went missing. Dad and others searched the aid stations and found the boy with a Colombian man who took him while fleeing after being caught stealing food. That's why the boy was separated from Dad's group. At the aid station, they learned Grandpa and my aunts had pneumonia. They rested there before heading to Mexico and then the United States. Grandparents and my aunts didn't make it across, but over time, they found work and a place in Mexico. Dad and Mom found a place in El Paso after getting asylum, along with other migrants from South America and Yemen. Dad became a construction worker, and Mom worked in a canteen. Now, we live in Uvalde, and after 30 years, my grandparents and aunts are here with us, far from the horrors of the Darien Gap.